Hello everyone, you are watching ITV Gold and I'm your host Aditi Lamba. On the show today, for the first time introducing STOP, Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. We have with us Mr. Cahn. He will be talking to us a lot about what STOP is and exactly what is it doing for the immigrant voices. And also for the first time, we get some comments coming in from the New Zealand shooting that happened last week, killing about 50 people. So right now on the show, let's welcome Cahn. Immigrant advocate, a huge voice for litigation for Muslim American voices, Jewish American voices, and so much more. Today he'll be talking to us about his passion towards minorities and his work as a lawyer and so much more on STOP. So let's welcome on the show we have with us Mr. Cahn. Welcome again on ITV Gold.
Thank you for having me back.
Albert, it's amazing. We are talking about STOP right now. It's a beautiful organization that you're starting. It's a non-profit. It has a lot of intense work that it has started to do already, and it has a huge term, surveillance and technology, attached to it. So just addressing that and beginning the interview with you, please give us an insight into what exactly are we talking about when we say the name Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, and what sort of initiated this thought process of having STOP?
Yeah, as you know, I've been a civil rights lawyer here in New York for a number of years, and I was privileged enough to have a position at CARE New York, heading up their legal work and advocacy work for the last 2.5 years. And when I was there, I saw that there was a need for an organization to push back at the way the NYPD and other local and state level police departments use surveillance technology. And by that I mean everything from cameras on the streets to new technology that tracks our phone, tracks where we are, tracks what we're saying, tracks what we're researching, and trying to make sure that those powerful tools, sometimes the same tools that the military uses, aren't used in a way that discriminates against communities of color, immigrant communities, and the Muslim community.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about this since we sort of brought into it. As your website says, STOP talks about harnessing technology and targeting surveillance. So for all our audiences, the surveillance we're talking about, according to STOP, is the fact that at times, as you said, Albert, people from minorities, Muslim immigrants, even the black minorities are targeted or discriminated against, and surveillance is used against them. And that's exactly what you are saying, that they are being targeted and tracked because they are a minority or because they're looked as somebody that I guess that need to be, surveillance at. So what's your opinion on this? And exactly why do you think the minorities are being, targeted in that aspect?
Yeah, the numbers here in New York are really telling. At a time when the New Zealand shooting shows us that white supremacist terrorism is one of the leading threats to national security, here in New York, 95% of NYPD intelligence investigations, 95% target Muslim New Yorkers. And at the same time, we also know that peaceful political movements in the African American community, like Black Lives Matter, are also targeted with warrantless surveillance. And because of that, we have a clear picture that New York is using this arsenal of spy equipment not to target the threat, but to target communities of color, to target immigrant communities, and to target the Muslim community.
Do you think this increases xenophobia? Is that one of the issues that you would be tackling with STOP? Do you believe that surveillance and targeting in this aspect directly impact these communities in a negative way?
Of course, 100%, because when we see these communities treated as a threat, not because of what they have done, but because of who they are, it perpetuates a cycle of stigmatization. We see the Muslim community in particular being stigmatized as a threat simply for their faith, for nothing else. And it's something that's been going on in New York City for over 15 years. Here we used to have a focus on in-person surveillance. Undercover officers and informants who would go into the mosques and see who was going to pray. They would actually go through neighborhoods and try to map out where Muslim communities lived. This was called the demographics unit. And that was an earlier version of surveillance back when you needed in-person informants in order to monitor who was where. But
Right.
now so much of that same surveillance can be carried out simply by looking at the data on our phones, simply by looking at the cameras on our streets and harnessing these new surveillance tools. And we at STOP think that it is wrong to have those tools used without proper oversight, without proper safeguards.
I know there are a few cases that you would be litigating, and hence a huge part of STOP is going to be bringing those cases on the forefront and talking about it. But my question to you is, you are being very specific right now and naming NYPD, you're naming local organizations here, you're talking about New York City itself. Many times people actually look at New York City as a landmark of diversity and acceptance, and perhaps one of the most friendly places for, say, the Muslim population. What is your comment on that? Because when you think about the NYPD and everything that STOP is saying, what would you say to somebody who is saying the fact that, oh, New York City is supposed to be more diverse, they are actually more open to the communities, they have more immigrants in their NYPD? What's your comment on that?
Well, I'm a proud New Yorker, and I've been an interfaith activist since I was 17 years old, and I believe that this city is remarkable for its diversity, for the fact that we come together in the trying times that we've recently had to stand together across divisions of race and religion. But I don't believe that our police departments here in New York City and across New York State live up to the promise of a diverse New York, of an inclusive New York, of the sort of New York you describe, the sort of New York that I believe in.
Yes. So talking just a little bit more about it, I kind of want to bring attention to audience on this one line that's actually, I got it from the STOP website. Under your works, it says, our work highlights discriminatory impact of warrantless, suspicionless surveillance on Muslim New Yorkers, immigrant New Yorkers, and New Yorkers of color. I would like for you to discuss what you mean by impact of warrantless, suspicionless surveillance. What does that mean? Where is it happening in? What kind of cases have you already seen that you would be litigating?
Yeah, I think that gets to the heart of our mission, because STOP isn't focused on ending surveillance. We're focused on ending discrimination. And we know that there are times when surveillance is justified. There are times when you can have the FBI or the NYPD going to a judge, getting a warrant, and saying, we have evidence to justify the use of surveillance on a specific individual because we think they're committing a specific crime. But what we see across this city is something far different. It's dragnet surveillance where everyone is being watched. For example, we have license plate readers across Manhattan that look at every car coming in and off of the island of Manhattan, and they're tracking those license plate numbers. They're tracking where those cars are, and it's not because anyone in those cars has been accused of a crime. It's simply because we want to know where everyone is at all times. And that sort of surveillance opens up the door to discrimination and opens up the door to the same sort of double standard we've seen for years through programs like Stop and Frisk.
Is this perhaps an invasion of privacy? And is this perhaps an invasion of privacy attached to increasing more fears for the immigrant population?
Completely. This definitely is an invasion of privacy, but more than that, we think it betrays the promise of being a sanctuary city, because we know that the city is collecting so much data on immigrant New Yorkers, where people live, where they work, where they are at various times.
Right.
They'll track that in databases without safeguards to make sure that it's not available to ICE. And as a city, if we are going to say we are a sanctuary city, if we're going to promise that we're going to keep immigrant families safe, regardless of their immigration status, we must also make sure we're not collecting data that makes us the eyes and ears of Donald Trump's deportation machine.
But that is a lot of data you're talking about. And the fact that you mentioned some huge parts of being tracked, how do you suppose this could really be actually handled? So what I mean to ask is, when STOP starts their work and when you are litigating and the bills and the reformations we're talking about, what exactly do you think needs to happen?
It all comes down to a basic question. For years, we've been asking, can we collect this data? And if we can, we would. But what STOP asks is, should we collect this data? Because we have examples where the data isn't justified, where the invasion of privacy isn't justified. One example is our lawsuit against the NYPD, a class action federal case where we are saying the city is violating the civil rights of Muslim New Yorkers because it will arrest them and force Muslim women to take off the hijab for a mugshot. We say it is unconstitutional to force Muslim women to remove the hijab. And the city is fighting us in court. And they haven't come forward to say that there's a reason why they need to do this. They haven't given us one example of how it's helpful to traumatize these women in this way. And so what we are saying in each and every case, it is just like this lawsuit. If you don't need to collect this data, and if you are potentially harming people because you're collecting it, then we are going to push back and say, no, you shouldn't.
Just a follow-up question on this lawsuit that you're fighting, Albert. How have these women felt that have gone through this?
I am so impressed by the clients who we represent in this case. One of them is a survivor of domestic violence who was arrested on charges fabricated by her abuser, who is then forced to remove the hijab in front of male officers, male prisoners, and traumatized in the process. And you know, she described it as being forced to undress herself. I mean, I can't begin to imagine what that was like, but what we're hoping is that by fighting in the courts, we can make the city do the right thing, that we can make them end this practice and make sure that no one else is traumatized in the same way.
Have there been other cases that have come about once you started fighting this lawsuit?
Yes, we know that there are numerous women who have been impacted by this policy. We know that there, in addition to Muslim women who wear the hijab, under the policy, it potentially also impacts, you know, Sikh men who wear turbans. It potentially impacts Jewish men who wear the yarmulke. So it really could impact a large number of religiously observant New Yorkers.
If I was to ask you about some key aspects for STOP right now for you, some key issues that you will target in the next couple of months since you know you've officially launched STOP, what do you think those key focuses for you would be?
Our top priority at City Hall is passage of the POST Act, the Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology Act, which will require the NYPD to provide City Council with a list of the spy tools it's using and the privacy policies they implement to make sure that we have proper safeguards for each and every tool deployed around the city. Our other priorities include ending the NYPD hijab removal policy and making sure that no one else is traumatized the way our clients have been. Other priorities include ending facial recognition. We've seen expanded use of facial recognition on bridges and tunnels around the city. Again, not just invading privacy, not just collecting data, but potentially endangering undocumented New Yorkers by gathering all this data in a place where it's potentially accessible to ICE.
Surveillance and racial profiling sometimes often get combined.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that is something that STOP is constantly fighting against. That's one huge issue that has impacted the country, not only just on a local or an NYPD level, but also on the levels of the FBI and the government. How do you suppose something like surveillance could actually be stopped? Do you, or perhaps my question should be, are you aware of how long your fight is going to be on this?
This fight isn't going to be over in months, it's not going to be over in years, it's going to take decades, because as long as this technology is advancing, as long as it is becoming cheaper and easier to spy on the public, it's going to become even more important for us to push back and make sure that privacy is protected. There are groups like STOP all across the country fighting in their communities to make sure that we protect privacy, and I'm just glad that we can bring that fight to New York City.
Do you think starting on perhaps a local level, as you said, there are a bunch of organizations throughout the nation right now that are doing pretty much the same thing in their home states or home cities, do you believe that that is actually a more efficient manner to control this problem than to go straight to the federal level and try to make changes on that?
Yeah, there are incredible groups that have been fighting this on the federal level for years, but we know that we can enact reforms more quickly, more aggressively, more progressively here at the local level if we truly have a committed community engagement and hold our leaders to account for their policies.
Albert, I kind of want to take right now this moment and sort of just, pay attention to the technology part of what Stop is doing. Technology has been such a huge part in, an increase of hate speech or hate being seen. Even with the recent shooting in New Zealand, there were surveillance has shown, that you could see the person who went live on Facebook. The shooter went live on Facebook, and he was able to put that horrific act there. Stop is working towards that as well. Technology has been a huge part of this issue of what is happening to the communities and what is being said about them or how is it being displayed. What are your comments on this? And how important do you think technology and all these advancements, say even on internet, are impacting communities of color, immigrant communities, especially Muslim American communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite clear that there is a double standard on a lot of these platforms, on Facebook, on Twitter, on other social media outlets, in how speech is regulated when it's speech by members of the Muslim community or speech directed at the Muslim community. We all the time we see the worst sort of anti-Muslim bigotry, hate speech allowed to stay up on these platforms. It will be flagged as inappropriate. It will be flagged as discriminatory, and it will still be permitted. Yet at the same time, these platforms have tools that will also target Muslim speakers. For example, I had an op-ed in Newsweek last year where I pointed out the case of Rohingya refugees who had fled to Myanmar, who are trying to describe the atrocities that their communities had endured, and their accounts were being removed. They were being removed by Facebook. They were being removed by artificial intelligence, by algorithms that are set up to find hate speech, to find inappropriate content. But the algorithms were wrong because they had been set up in such a way that they mistook the victims' statements, the statements of those who had endured these horrible crimes, and they thought they were statements threatening violence. And we see those sorts of mistakes time and again. We see this double standard time and again. And when we see the horror that unfolded in New Zealand, we know there's a real price that's being paid by so many communities when that sort of white supremacist hate is allowed free reign on the internet.
Let me ask you something, especially favored on the whole theme behind Stop. If you have an issue such as this that is being massively discussed right now of what can be allowed on media platforms, on social media platforms, on Facebook, Twitter, what should really be seen, and obviously there has been a lot that's been allowed, a lot that has been shown that's traumatizing many members of the community. How would Stop try to fight that, and how do you plan to combat that part of technology? Because that is huge. We have cases right now, federal cases on Facebook by the United States government for pretty much the same reasons of impacting speeches, impacting what people are thinking, perhaps even allowing groups to be formed to, plot or to showcase. What's your comment on that?
Our first priority is to end the double standard.
Right.
We cannot have one standard for white supremacist threats and one standard for every other group. If Facebook or Twitter is going to remove these threats, if they're going to remove discriminatory statements, they need to remove them from everyone.
Right.
But if you look at the Facebook standards for what content is appropriate, they have one section for hate speech and one section for terrorism. They need to recognize that white supremacist hate speech is an incitement to terrorism.
Right.
They need to hold these groups to the same standard.
Is that what you would be working on with Stop? Is that one of your biggest focuses as well?
So we definitely focus on, and this gets a little technical, we focus on algorithmic bias.
Okay.
So how do computer programs have bias in the way that they look at different forms of speech? Because one of the issues that comes up is people hear about an algorithm, they hear about artificial intelligence, and they assume it's going to be neutral. They assume that because it's a computer, it can't have the same sort of bias that individuals normally have.
Or perhaps they think that it's actually a good thing because it's intelligence or technology or something that's advanced. You wouldn't think necessarily for it to be negative.
Exactly, but the reality is that these algorithms have the same biases as the people who create them. That when you are creating an algorithm, when you are creating a tool, you are making decisions. And when you are writing the rules for it, you are making decisions. And when that algorithm goes out and is flagging content, is removing content, it is using those same biases as its creator. For example, if the gunman in New Zealand if he had been using a different weapon, one along the lines that we've seen in videos from ISIL and other groups.
Beheadings, correct?
Exactly. It would have been flagged and it would have been removed by Facebook's automated content removal system because they set that up looking at those sorts of ISIL videos, those sorts of beheading videos. Yet the same sort of video is not flagged when it's a gunman, even though that is just as deadly, even though he took far more lives, because of those same biases.
This is very complicated.
It is, and that's one of the things that we really want to focus on at STOP, is how do we take the complex systems that operate behind these social media platforms, the millions of decisions that go into how they operate, and make it accessible to everyone, and make sure that we don't have double standards, that we don't have discrimination, and we don't have bias baked into who is allowed to speak.
Just taking off of this, everything that STOP is talking about, and especially what has happened sort of in the world in the last week on Muslim sentiments, on immigrant sentiments, on the concepts of xenophobia and so much more, I would like for you to make a comment on behalf of STOP on what happened with the mass shooting in New Zealand, the act of white supremacist terrorism. 50 people have died. The New Zealand Prime Minister have condemned the terrorist attack. She is, in full support to empower the immigrant communities there. New Zealand is supposed to be one of the safest countries in the world, and they're going through something very tragic. But it really brings forth the concept of the immigrant population being discriminated, and especially the members of the Islamic faith being discriminated and targeted and shot. It's exactly what you were fighting for in that aspect, for the representation of the Muslim community and for that respect and dignity to be maintained for people and the places of worship and faith. So I would like for you to give a comment on this.
Look, as a Jewish man who has been fighting for the Muslim community for many years, who has been an interfaith advocate for my entire adult life, it's heartbreaking when I see a place of faith, a place of safety, a place of community, turned into a crime scene. When I see those photos of the small children, the elderly, everyone just being targeted, being killed because of their faith. I don't know if there are words that can fully capture that. But what I think I have taken away from the last few days has been just incredible awe at the resilience I see from my Muslim brothers and sisters every day in the face of this sort of hate. And at least here in New York, I see renewed reason for optimism that we have solidarity to come together in these moments. That in the darkness following this brutal attack, that there is a willingness of New Yorkers of every faith, of every race, of every ethnicity to come together and say that we will stand united as a city in the face of this sort of bloodshed.
I noticed on your website there's actually an option to report.
Yeah.
How important do you think that one option is, and how important do you think that's going to play when you start fighting these cases?
I mean, it's crucial because the only way we can bring these lawsuits, the only way that we can hold those in power to account is if those who are directly impacted come forward and report what they're seeing. And that's what allowed us to bring our lawsuits so far, and that's what I know will allow us to bring more lawsuits in the future, to make sure that when we aren't able to enact policies through the city council or through Albany, that we can still go to court to make sure that the Constitution is respected.
Yes, so I hope anybody that is in need, remember you could reach out to STOP and you can reach out to Albert. Albert, what do you have to say about this entire team that you have set up? There's some very inspiring people. I've seen some South Asians on your board as well. Mm-hmm. I would like for you to discuss with me a little bit about how this team has been for you, mm-hmm. and what do you have to say about their work ethic and their passion?
So obviously, as someone who is not a part of the community, I thought it was incredibly important to make sure that members of the impacted communities were at the forefront. We're yes. setting the policies, we're setting the direction of the organization. And that's why I'm so excited that our community advisory board includes members of nationally recognized groups like National Action Network and Arab American Association of New York. We right. have a growing roster of community leaders who are going to be setting our strategic vision and making sure that our organization is taking on what matters most to the community.
So what is on your strategic agenda for the next couple of months, Albert? Whatever you can tell our viewers, I would like to know what can we look forward to when it comes to STOP, and how can we as community members help STOP?
Well, if you want to engage with us on social media, that's the easiest way to keep up to date on what we're doing. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram at Stop Spying NY. We're going to be fighting in court to end the NYPD hijab policy. We're going to be fighting at City Hall for enactment of the Post Act. We're going to be fighting in Albany to end facial recognition. We're going to be taking on probably more than a half dozen bills throughout this year. So really our focus is to litigate, to educate, to legislate, and to advocate, and to use all four of those channels to make sure that we're fighting back against this sort of discriminatory surveillance.
Wow. Well, I can only wish you the best for it. One last message for all our viewers. Anything that you would like to say about STOP, and anything you would like to say to all the South Asians that are watching on ITV Gold?
I think it's crucial that none of us accept this sort of surveillance as normal. It's been growing piece by piece for so many years. We know there are all these ways we're being tracked, and sometimes it's easy to just dismiss it, but really it's fundamentally changed the balance of power in our society. It's fundamentally changed what it means to have privacy, to have autonomy, to have freedom of speech. And none of us should accept that these age-old rights need to go away simply because technology is getting easier or faster or cheaper. This is a fight that won't be easy to win. It won't be quick to win.
Right.
But I really believe that here in New York, we can set the standard for what surveillance reform looks like nationwide.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for being with us on ITV Gold. I'm sure the audience gained as much perspective as I did. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And that was none other than Mr. Albert Cahn. Go on the STOP website, take a look at what they have to say, and remember, if you are a victim or if you think something is wrong being happening to you, please report. I'm Aditi Lamba, signing off.